is the fragmentation of silviculturist.
Yeah, you're gonna have to go back. Right there. That's good. That's good. There we go. All right. So just a little overview. We're going to start kind of the first part of this talk, talking a bit about the forest ecology of forested wetlands. So I'm going to give a little bit of some definitions there. And then we're going to look at what are the importance of those forested wetlands, and also maybe more importantly, what are some of the challenges that those wetlands have faced over the years? And some of them are really obvious and you'll know them, but some of them maybe you've thought less about. And then it's going to kind of go off the tracks a little bit, because that's where we're just going to talk about really cool wetland tree species. And we can't talk about all of them, but we've my colleague Brad Hutnick and I, we picked some favorites, and I'll show you why. So I'm going to break down, there's different ways to define forested wetlands, but I'm going to break it down into two major categories. And the first is wet forests. And these we might go by other names like swamps, bogs, fens, and those, as many of you probably know, have certain definitions. But all of these forested wetlands are influenced by a water table that's near the surface. Sometimes it might be 4 or 6 feet down, but other times it might be right at the surface, and it fluctuates seasonally based on that groundwater that's there and precipitation in the surrounding basin. And so that seasonal water fluctuation has a real influence on the vegetation and the forest trees that grow there. The soils in these wet forests can be organic mucks, peats. They can also be mineral soils, or they can be a combination of both. And that also influences the type of trees we see grow on those forested wetlands. Sometimes you might get a small mineral organic layer over a mineral, and that can be really good conditions for growing trees that require greater levels of nutrients. So all of that influences the species composition. And of course, then you have trees that have to be adapted in some way to those wet conditions. And some of them you may not think are trees that are adapted to wet conditions. So think of a species like jack pine, the scrubbiest kind of pine that grows on the driest sands. It will also grow in a wetland forest if there is enough drainage in that top layer. So we see jack pine stands, for instance, on some of the peat areas in the Black River State Forest. So think of species here like black spruce, black ash, tamarack, northern white cedar, red maple. These would be all common wet forest species of these swamps, bogs, and fens. And then the other major category then is floodplain forest. And so these, as it indicates, are associated with the floodplains along streams and rivers. So we have major floodplain forests, as you know, along the Mississippi River, where I live, the Wisconsin River, but we also have smaller floodplain forests. Think about river systems like the Wolf, for example. And here, the water comes in a different manner. It comes through that rush of flooding in the spring, as we are right now, as water levels rise on rivers, and through major storm events that concentrate water in those watersheds. And so in that sense, the water is much more predictable. We know it's going to rise and come in the spring, and usually it lasts for a certain period of time and goes away. Also, the soils are going to be different in those areas. So the soils in a floodplain are caused by the sediment that's carried and deposited from that river. And because the speed of that water flow is different, it deposits different size particles in different places, forming a really neat topography in a floodplain forest. And this diagram you see at the bottom indicates some of the common definitions we use in a floodplain bottom topography. So for instance, the levee, which is where the fastest water course is right next to the river, deposits those larger grained sands. And so you get kind of a mound. But the backwaters, those first bottoms, the water slows down and deposits more silts and fine material. And so you get a lot more variety of tree species that grow on all of these different micro topographies. So it's kind of cool if you're ever in a floodplain forest and you're walking, say, from the river inland, think about that topography and see if you can recognize some of those different attributes. So as I said, variety, think about species like silver maple, cottonwood, swamp white oak, really cool tree we're going to talk about, green ash. Those would be common species in these floodplain forests. Now, I'm not going to dwell a lot on this slide because I think of all people, this group should really probably already have a pretty good appreciation for the importance of some of these wetlands. These forested wetlands would be similar to some of the benefits and importance of all wetlands. So acting to regulate water flow, protecting shorelines through those root and that vegetation system, improving water quality. So, you know, a great filtering mechanism. These wetland forests are oftentimes diverse and important areas for a variety of wildlife, particularly acting as migratory corridors. So think about major corridors like the Mississippi River, and those floodplain forests along there act as great migratory corridors, for instance, for songbirds, and provide that sort of contiguous cover. There also are large carbon stores, particularly some of those wet forests I talked about with peat in them. They have some of the highest concentrations of carbon storage on the planet. And they're also culturally and spiritually significant. So not only indigenous peoples, these wetlands, shorelands were very significant to them, but to all of us. And that's why we're here at a conference like this. So forest health challenges. Over the decades and the centuries, these wetland forests have gone through a number of challenges that have impacted why they look the way they do today. One of them, post-European settlement, was what we call the Great Cutover. So you may be familiar with that, where much of northern Wisconsin was mined for the timber resource to build a growing population. But a lot of people think about the cutover maybe, and I always did, kind of in this sort of, they went and they clear cut everything, right? They just cut it all clean and they tried to farm it. Well, actually, in some places it was like that, but in a lot of senses, it happened in waves. They removed different species at different times over several decades. And that impacted what we see in those forested wetlands. So the first thing to go were the pines. So the white pine and the red pine could be easily floated down rivers. They didn't have road or rail systems, so they needed to move it down rivers. So those species went first. And some of those species, including white pine, were dominant even in forested wetlands. Then they might have removed other species. This picture on the right is a pile of hemlock bark. So the tanneries started to use hemlock bark in the tanning process. And so people would go out, harvest hemlock, strip the bark off it, stack it in these nice, neat piles, and then ship it to the tannery. This pile just never got moved and is still rotting in the woods today. So there you had a wave of hemlock removal. particularly from some of those wetland forest types. And I kind of like this graph. This is just a little analysis we did. We looked at all of our black ash swamps that were on state properties in northern Wisconsin, and we compared those black ash swamps to what the public land survey indicated were the primary species in those same areas prior to a lot of this cutting. And as you can see, black ash is, I think, 5 down the list here. A lot of other species were dominant in these wetland forests that are today primarily black ash. And the concern there is they're susceptible to emerald ash borer. And we're trying to diversify those forests. We also saw great change in those wetland forests, just like all other wetlands. So for a large period of our settlement here, we started to manipulate these waterways. So not only large dam systems like along the Mississippi and the Wisconsin, but smaller things like roadways that acted as dams and started to impact these forested wetlands. And drainage, all of that impacted not only the species that could grow there, but how well they could reproduce, because we changed that sort of cycle on how those trees reproduce within those systems. So that's still impacting these forests to a great deal today. This was just another cool old chart I thought you'd be interested in. It's from 1948, and it was sort of bragging about the dam system along the Wisconsin River and how well it evened out the flow. The dark black line in the middle sort of indicates the flow of the river, and the shaded in area above indicates the water that was held back by the dams. In other words, these would have been the peak. Whoops, turn it. These would have been the peaks in the flow, and then these would have been the lows during other parts of the year. And that cyclic large flooding with drier periods allowed trees to reproduce on those sites. But the dams, one of the unintended consequences was evening out that flow, created conditions where those trees couldn't reproduce as well on those systems. So everything has impacts to those forested systems. And then fire suppression, we decided forest fires were not a good thing, and we decided as a society to suppress them. And for some reasons that was good, but it also had unintended consequences for those forests. Many of those forests, even wetland forests, were heavily influenced by fire disturbance historically. And that allowed certain trees to benefit, to reproduce well, and to maintain those systems. And without fire in those systems, the forests began to change. That's particularly true in the uplands, but it is also true in our wetland forests. And we'll look at some species that really are influenced and adapted to a fire disturbance scenario. And then, like I said, more familiar things, diseases came along. In the 70s, Dutch elm disease had a huge impact on wetland forests and the elm growing in those systems. Elm used to grow very large and produce large structural trees within those forests. Most of that was lost due to Dutch elm disease. Elm has some level of resistance and is hung around and is still reproducing and is becoming abundant in those systems. It doesn't reach the size of the trees that it used to, but it is still there and hopefully developing more resistance over time. In the 2000s, we saw the incoming of the Asian emerald ash borer, which affects all of our ash species. This guy is a little bit more efficient killer, and there is some level of resistance that we're seeing in natural ash populations. We're working with that resistance and trying to develop stock for that. So maybe ash will hang around at a low level like elm and slowly build resistance naturally over time. We don't know that yet, but it is having large impacts to those ash systems. And as foresters, silviculturists, we're looking to figure out how to manage some of these black ash swamps that are dominated by ash and going to be heavily impacted by EAB. How can we start to develop other tree species reproducing in those areas? This is an example of what's called a strip shelter wood, basically trying to create a sheltered, shaded, disturbed area through that swamp to stimulate other tree species to start to naturally regenerate in that opening, so we can start to diversify those stands before emerald ash borer comes into them. So that's an area of research. And finally, climate change is going to have an impact on all of our species in terms of natural reproduction, of insect populations that can have more life cycles, of periods of drought. All of these are going to impact forest health to some degree. And we're going to talk about this when we look at some of these species. So what can you do as a landowner or an organization who is working with these forested wetlands and shorelands? One thing you can do is protect what you got. So look at things like trying to, as we're doing in those black ash stands, trying to maintain diversity, manage them properly. On shorelands, trying to keep natural vegetation along those shorelines. As a property owner or a shoreland owner, protecting the root zones of those species if soil is going to be moved in areas, or even pruning at the right time of the year in the dormant season when insects and diseases are not active. All of these things can be done to kind of protect some of those species that are still intact. Or if that stand or that shoreline or that wetland is degraded, you can look to trying to restore some of that diversity or rehabilitate it. And I have a colleague, Laura Kenefek, that gave this kind of, I thought was a cool analogy between restoring and rehabilitating. So restoring is trying to bring back the same kind of composition, structure, and function something had originally at some reference point. So in this case, say an 1800s cabin kitchen, and using all the same kind of appliances. Rehabilitation is trying to restore some of that function and composition, but it may not look exactly like the original. And this may be the case for a forested shoreline where it was once adapted to fire disturbance. You may not want to be burning your shoreline on a regular basis. So you might be looking at something that functions a little differently than it did before, but still meets your objectives. So we could talk about lots of really cool forest species that grow in these wetlands, but we don't have enough time to do that for all of them. One of the keys, though, that I want to get across to you is if you're trying to manage these wetland forest species, we have a saying in reforestation: the right tree, the right place, and the right time. So it's a little like the real estate: location, location, location. The idea is you need to match the tree to the site conditions that you have and the right timing of both planting in terms of not only seasonally, but in terms of the stage that that forest is at. You wouldn't, for example, go into a very mature forest and try to plant a tree that requires full sunlight in the understory of that. There has to be a certain level of timing there. So choosing the right tree species involves all of those things. I'd like to talk about all of these, but I can't. So my colleague Brad and I, we sat down, we came up with the 10 wetlands trees you should have planted yesterday. So this is that's kind of clickbait, but thought it was cute. Brad and I work together quite closely, and we often think our humor is good, but most people don't. So first, let's look at a couple of species that come out of those wet forests. And we chose species that are relatively easy to establish and plant. They have good what we call juvenile growth rates. When they're young, they grow quite rapidly. And they also provide a large number of benefits. So this was kind of some of the criteria we used to narrow down this list. And you may or may not agree with some of these. You might think, what? I'm not going to plant that. So first one is tamarack. And before I get into tamarack, I'm not going to talk about all these aspects on the slide, but I wanted to put up just some of the key elements we need to think about when finding the right tree, putting the right tree in the right place. So I wanted to give you an idea of size. So I put up there the state champion tree. So that just gives you a perspective on how large some of these trees can get. You have to realize, though, the way we judge state champion trees is really a combined factor of the height, the circumference, and the crown spread. And so some of these may not look that tall. Like I thought, oh, that could get a lot higher than that. But that tree probably had some other factor like a big circumference or a big crown spread that ran the score up. But it gives you an idea how big they can get. Also, how long they can live. The general range they fall in, what kind of site they might grow in. And since we're talking about wetland forests, kind of what their tolerance is for water. So in any wetland, you're going to have those different periods of inundation. Some trees are going to be able to tolerate longer periods than others. So that's really important and key. Some forest health and wildlife values. And then also something folks are often curious about too is how is this species projected to do in a changing climate? And for that, we look to a Forest Service tool called the Tree Atlas. And the Tree Atlas develops projections on suitable habitat for tree species based on different climate models. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit with each of these species. And then some planting tips. So first, larch. It's our tamarack. It's our native larch species in the state. It's the one conifer that loses its needles in the winter, turns that nice bright yellow in the fall, so it's really pretty. We find it primarily in northern Wisconsin, but surprisingly, you have tamarack marshes, sometimes they're called, in southern Wisconsin, in areas that are a little cooler and more protected. There used to, I believe, be more of those, but tamarack also makes good structural lumber. So a number of those were harvested during settlement for things like barn beams. The lumber from tamarack has very little deflection, so it's good in those situations, as well as tobacco shed poles. They use those often in that situation. So again, those wetlands have been changed over time due to some of those disturbances. It's a species a tree that grows quite rapidly, especially at a juvenile age. It's a tree of the swamp, but you can actually plant tamarack in an upland setting and it will grow quite well. It doesn't grow there. We don't see it there naturally reproducing just because it can't compete with all of the other hardwoods in that type of setting. From a forestry standpoint, we regenerate tamarack through natural regeneration. It germinates quite well, like a number of wetland species do, on sphagnum peat. And so if you can create a disturbance in a tamarack swamp and still have that seed source close by, it will germinate quite well in that peat. From a climate perspective, you can see, that doesn't look really good, Greg. It's kind of a no change in suitable habitat in the north, even a small decrease in the south. And its adaptability score, that's based on some of the biological capabilities of the species. And it gives it a rank on how adaptable it is in a changing climate. For tamarack, it's low. And one thing I'll say about the Tree Atlas data, though, it's not the only factor you need to take into consideration when deciding what trees to manage and what trees to plant. It's just another piece of information and a consideration. Tamarack, even in southern Wisconsin, as long as you meet some of these other conditions, it will hang around and it will grow, I believe, long-term, even in a changing climate. So we can't rule it out just because the tree atlas says a small decrease, but do keep that in mind that it doesn't appear as it will be as adaptable moving forward. If you're planting this species, I have these indicators right here, a 1.0 and 2.0 seedling. What does that mean? So I'm going to give you an idea of what type of reforestation seedling we would typically plant of this. Those are seedlings that we would grow in a reforestation nursery, like our state nursery system. They can be bare root, so they're lifted and they're just a bare root seedling, or they can be containerized, be situated in a container, but that's what we would typically plant when we're planting large numbers of trees, as opposed to like you would plant in your yard, a ball and burlap sort of tree. A 1.0 and a 2.0 just indicates the years that that tree has been in the nursery bed. So a 1.0 is a 1-year-old seedling and a 2.0 is a 2-year-old seedling. In general, it's going to depend on species, but 1.0s are generally about a pencil size tree, and a 2.0 is about a a double pencil size in diameter of the stem. Generally for wetland trees, these are difficult planting conditions because of that wetness. And so you want generally a larger seedling to plant. But for tamarack, grows pretty well. Even a 1.0, 1-year-old seedling will do quite well. Another wet forest species, and this one, if there's any foresters in the room, might raise an eyebrow, red maple, because oftentimes foresters might see this as a bit of a weed species because it comes into areas where we might be trying to manage for other species, for instance, oak, and it is a strong competitor. But that's what also makes it a really good tree in the right place to plant and grow. It is widely adapted to a number of different soil types. So it will tolerate wet, not super wet. It's usually sort of on the edge of very wet swamps into the upland, all the way up to very dry soils. It is moderately tolerant of floods. It can grow both in full sun and partial shade, so that gives it flexibility for planting. It is a favorite deer browse species. So if you're planting nursery stock of red maple, you may need to protect that in some way because it will be a target. And from a climate change perspective, it's kind of a no change, small decrease in suitable habitat, but look at the adaptability score. It is really high. And that's why red maple is becoming sort of really ubiquitous across Eastern United States. It is a tree that would have been killed much more easily by fire. And because of fire suppression, we see red maple becoming much more abundant in all of our forest systems. If you're planting this species, you generally want to plant a large seedling, 2- or 3-year-old. You want a large, fairly bushy root system on that seedling to get good survival. And as I said, you have a lot of flexibility. It grows range wide in the state, grows on a wide variety of sites, and is a good juvenile grower. So very easy to establish in that sense. Wanted to give you some floodplain forest species of significance. Silver maple, another great species for planting, has good juvenile growth rates. So easy to plant, easy to establish. It's not a tree you probably want to plant next to your house. So if you've got a big silver maple sitting next to your house, like I used to, you're probably cursing it because, you know, the seeds and the flower buds are in the gutters, the roots grow into places they shouldn't. And that's because wetland species oftentimes They are good urban trees because they have to be aggressive rooters in a bottomland situation where they're seeking out oxygenated soil that they can live in. But don't plant it by your house. But if you're planting it along a floodplain or shoreline, it is an excellent species to consider. And it has lots of wildlife values. It develops large stems, large structures. It can break off easily, which for wildlife is a good thing, produce cavities, coarse down woody debris, all of that. And from a climate perspective, it's projected to do quite well. High adaptability, increases in habitat across the Wisconsin. You see that it doesn't quite naturally range into northern Wisconsin, but this species will and probably is continuing to move northward up river systems. Another species you probably don't want to plant in your yard next to your house is eastern cottonwood, but from a floodplain forest situation, this is an excellent tree. It is, from a wildlife perspective, produces large diameters, large structures, oftentimes cavities that wood ducks, for example, live in. Lots of down coarse woody debris. That's good for a lot of things. Along the Mississippi, you'll see cottonwoods oftentimes with preferred eagle nest trees just because of their size, height, and stature. From a climate perspective, it's projected to do quite well in a changing climate. And from a reforestation perspective, you don't oftentimes find cottonwood for sale in a nursery just as a seedling, but oftentimes as a cutting. And by a cutting, I mean we take the recent growth of branches or stems in the tree, cut it into segments, and then just stick those segments into the ground, and they will naturally root and establish. So nurseries will sell cuttings, but you can also take cuttings if you have a source to take those from. Again, excellent juvenile growth on the species. So you see on the Mississippi River, for example, sometimes the Army Corps of Engineers will use cottonwood cuttings in very difficult sites with a lot of reed canary grass, just to try to get some tree species going within that area by inserting cuttings. A really cool species I want to talk about is swamp white oak. This is a species of a native species of our floodplain forest, particularly in the southern 2/3 of the state. But it's a large stature oak species, just like all the white oak, grows a long time, 300 to 400 years. It also has great wildlife value. If you've ever looked closely at swamp white oak acorns, they are variable, but they can be quite large. And we're oftentimes racing both the deer, the squirrels, the ducks, everything wants those acorns in the fall. And so collecting them can be quite challenging sometimes. So from a wildlife perspective, they're a great tree. They also, as a white oak species, they'll tolerate partial shade. So we, in some cases, are underplanting species like white oak into ash stands that are dying from EAB to get them established. So when the overstory dies, those swamp white oak can be there to take over that space. So they're kind of a cool species from that perspective. From a climate perspective, you can see kind of greens and yellows, small increases in suitable habitat. This species is on its southern edge. It will move north as species or as that climate warms. And in some of these ash silvicultural trials that I talked about, swamp white oak is oftentimes a species that we see doing best across the Lake States area. So really neat species. You see it planted more, but it has lots of potential. River birch, another floodplain species, kind of this really pink salmon colored flaky bark. It's not projected to do all that well from a climate perspective. As you can see, it mainly grows along the Mississippi and Wisconsin River in Wisconsin. But in, I would say, the southern 2/3 of the state along those floodplains, it is a species to consider. One of it is its plantability. Its juvenile growth rate is great. Once you get it established in the ground, it can put on 4 feet in height growth a year. So that makes it a little bit easier. And also, just from a shoreline perspective, it has that really nice flaky bark that looks cool, but it also is used by a lot of different birds for insect feeding. So an important species in those settings. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk about some tree species that are more upland species, and we don't necessarily always see them in a forested wetland that's very wet, but we will see them along shorelines, and they're significant, very important species to consider if you're restoring or rehabilitating these areas. Kind of the king of pines is the white pine, and especially along our shorelines, a very significant visible species. One of the reasons is it's one of our tallest species in the state. There's the state record at 157 feet. It's very long lived, up to 400 or 500 years. It grows across the entire state. So that gives it some flexibility if you're considering planting a species. It likes kind of this, it likes, sorry about that. It likes sort of the sandy loam soils, but white pine is very flexible and adaptable in terms of what you'll see for soils that it grows on and grows on well. The heavier soils, it will grow well. Oftentimes you don't see it there in abundance just because it can't compete with all of the other hardwoods. But it has a lot of flexibility. You might be worried about things like white pine blister rust. Generally speaking, white pine blister rust, it's a fungus that can infect and kill these trees, but we see it most in certain areas of the state where there's a high level of humidity and moisture. So think about the clay plain along Lake Superior that gets sort of that humidity and fog off of the lake. That's a high humidity area where we see lots of white pine blister rust. But if you get down into the central sands, for example, where there's lots of white pine, it'll be there, but it won't generally be a large deterrent. So it depends on where you are for that disease. It's very significant in terms of wildlife. Eagles and osprey oftentimes use these species, again, because of their stature and height. And any tree that grows to this size produces a lot of wildlife benefits because it has a large structure, and so it can produce large cavities and the like. From a climate perspective, in the north, it's projected to increase in habitat. In the south, a large decrease. So again, I think in more protected environments, like in the driftless area, in some of the coulees, we'll see white pine being able to maintain itself, but it may not do well in some other areas. And if you're planting it, nursery stock in particular may be susceptible to deer browse, so you may need to protect it in some way. Another big pine species that we see along our shorelines is red pine. Red pine is one of those very fire adapted species. Though our shorelines, ones in particular where we see remnant red pine, probably were much more open forest systems. They probably experienced a lot more fire in the past. They've now become more enclosed forest. And so the conditions aren't ideal for red pine without that fire. Indigenous peoples would have probably managed with fire, particularly along those waterways. They would have used red pine for the pitch, for canoes. So a very important species that way. So you may need to, if you want to get red pine into those areas like along shorelines, you may need to use planting because we just don't have that natural disturbance of fire there, maintaining those open pine systems in those areas. And finally, I needed to throw in another oak species because they're a great species to plant for a lot of different reasons. Northern red oak is a species that is, again, considered an upland species, but you'll see it growing on those drier shorelines, and it is a great option to consider planting. It grows, despite what people think about oak species, it grows quite rapidly as a young tree, so it's pretty easy to establish. You want a fairly large root system seedling, and it's projected to do quite well in terms of climate change in Wisconsin. And it's well distributed across the entire state. So just from those perspectives, the wildlife values, the easiness of growing it, the abundance of it from the nurseries, most nurseries have this stock. It's a good one to consider if you have those more drier type of shoreline situations or wetland edges. And I'm going to end this show with a bit of a plug. So I started by talking about silviculture. My colleague Brad and I, we have a podcast called Silvicast, and it really is oriented towards foresters and biologists talking in depth about silviculture. But I know if you want to get into the weeds around silviculture, you can tune into Silvicast, and it's available on any of your podcast outlets. Just have to search for it. And I'll end with this very nice picture from one of our wildlife biologist supervisors, Michelle Woodford. Very nice, kind of showing that shoreline perspective with white pine in the background. And with that, I'm going to kind of open it up to questions about.
Great. We have 5 minutes for questions. So folks, please, if you could speak up, Jim and others, as you present your talk.
Well, what we have in the whole of Eastern North America, sometimes foresters refer to it as an oak regeneration problem. Oak is a fire adapted species. And because we don't have those regular fire disturbance, keeping out species like red maple, those forests are succeeding from oak to other species. So that is our biggest issue. There are diseases like oak wilt, which is another fungus that can get into oak through wounds, and then it moves through the root systems, through root grafts. That can be a significant problem locally, but overall in the oak population, it isn't the limiting factor. The limiting factor is the regeneration problem with the lack of disturbance. And silviculturists, researchers, foresters have been studying the oak regeneration problem for the last 60 years. We kind of know what the answer is, but it's very difficult to reintroduce fire back into our systems to the degree that it used to be.
Another question, and we'll get to another growth. Planted species such as black ash, is there one species you'd recommend to replace it, or?
It's really going to be that right tree in the right place at the right time. So, so not all black ash swamps are created equally. You have all this variation, as we talked about, in hydrology, in the soils, and all of that's going to influence the species that would be best to reestablish there. And so you need to look at your particular site and system to make those decisions. In some areas, things like black spruce and tamarack, those are very appropriate. But in other areas, you may be looking at a much richer low wetland and looking at species like swamp white oak. So there's a kind of a whole host of species you can plant, but it's going to be site dependent. And you want to seek diversity in those stands too, not just one particular species. That's some of the issue we're running into with the black ash. Mhm. Yep. Yep. So that's a big issue that we are always struggling with. So those trees, what he's referring to is trees are basically a hydrological pump. And so they're keeping that groundwater a bit at bay. And so if emerald ash borer, for example, comes into a pure ash stand and kills it, and you lose those pumps, then that water table can come up and it can become too wet to establish trees, what foresters refer to as swamping. One thing that can be done in those situations is to be proactive, is to try to look at rehabilitating some of those more pure ash stands before emerald ash borer removes or kills those hydrological pumps. And that's using things like I showed you there, the strip shelterwood method, doing things like underplanting in those systems prior to the ash dying. Not all swamps are going to swamp out after EAB moves into them. That's going to depend also on the local hydrology of those sites. But some will have that issue. We squeeze in. Mhm. Mhm. Swamp it out. Yeah, deer browsing is a huge issue depending on where you are located in the state, particularly on our hardwood species. As I said, particularly on nursery stock that might have more nutrient levels within them because they fertilize them within the nursery. In those situations, really all we can do is look at mitigating techniques. So keeping the deer off of them. And there's different techniques for that, and they have pluses and minuses. So you're using cages, that's probably pretty good. On a larger scale, foresters have been using temporary fencing. There's a polypropylene 8-foot fencing that they fence off, say, regeneration gaps to try to protect that regeneration. There are some repellents that do work, but they require reapplication, especially during the right time of year. And if you're planting hardwoods, the real vulnerable time for browsing is right now through July. So that new growth that's coming out of those seedlings, and that's when you really need to protect them. Conifers, we can do things like bud capping. They tend to get browsed in the winter when they're the only green thing around. And so we put basically paper cards over the terminal branch that keeps them from browsing that terminal bud, and they can browse the rest of it, but then it can keep growing. So kind of that whole arsenal of techniques is what you have to employ if you're in a high browse area. And wetlands are often, you know, wintering kind of, they can be winter yarding areas for cedar, for example. So they can concentrate those animals and the problem can be more difficult. So a lot there to chew on in that topic area. Ah, I didn't try. Thanks.
Off to a great start. We will start a session.